All right, welcome back. Today we will be looking at the Roman Revolution. So Rome's expansion after the Punic Wars, or Rome's expansion first in Italy and then in the broader Mediterranean, set the stage for what we call the Roman Revolution. It put certain pressures on the Roman political system. It challenged the traditional dominance of the patrician classes, even in the Republic. It challenges the tradition of patronage, and it even challenges family values. So a number of new pressures that the Roman era of expansion puts on the system will usher in the what we call the Roman Revolution. So the Roman Revolution is a long period of change from 133 to 31 BCE, beginning with the Gracchi brothers and ending with the reign of Julius Caesar's adopted nephew, Augustus. So the Roman Revolution is different than how we typically understand a revolution. Typically, we think of revolutions as relatively short, as being violent and resulting in a form of government that is more radical, not more conservative. The Roman Revolution is the opposite. It is not short and catastrophic. It is a long series of events, that do not make Rome more democratic, but actually destroys the Republic and establishes a monarchy, a empire. So a question to think about is, to what extent was the empire, the territorial expansion, related to this more conservative authoritarian system? The argument goes, if the Romans hadn't been so imperialistic and expansionist, perhaps Rome may have remained more democratic. Okay, something to think about. Okay, so we're going to look at the stresses which the new empire places on Rome. Okay, basically by the end of the Punic Wars, Rome is now the leading world power at this time in the ancient world. Okay, the main problem facing Roman society after the Punic Wars was the disappearance and decline of the small independent farmer. Okay, the small landowning farmers had gradually been dispossessed from their lands in the wars of expansion. So it is often said in books and whatnot that the independent middle-class farmer was the backbone of the Roman army, right? So if you went into the Roman legions, the average citizen soldier would be a middle-class, moderately prosperous, independent farmer who owned his own farm. Remember, the farmers, the citizen soldiers, are expected to provide their own equipment, and they are not actually receiving pay because they are expected to provide for themselves on their own farms. The decline of the small independent farmer has profound consequences that are at once political, social, economic, and also military. And no less, they also affect family structure and cultural value. So this is a huge problem. Okay, basically, these small independent farmers who were the backbone of the Roman army during these wars of expansion were being called away from their farms for longer and longer periods of time to fight. Typically, they fought in the summer but returned to their families in the fall for the harvest. But now, with the wars of expansion, these soldiers were being called away from their farms for longer and longer periods of time, and sometimes, 2/3 of or their whole adult lives. The army, which was always levied before, it was ad hoc, it was not permanent or professional. The army now became quasi-permanent, and by this time, the end of the Punic Wars, it's about 50,000 men. So as a result, while they were away, the farms of many of these independent citizen soldier legionaries were sieged. because as the period that these soldiers went away was more prolonged, they were away for long periods of time, the farm often went unattended or dilapidated, and simply put, their family members couldn't keep it up. So when they came back, the veterans were dispossessed from their land. While they were away, because oftentimes the family members could not keep up the farms, the farms were seized and converted by the rich into large landed estates, or the so-called latifundia. Latifundia sort of means plantations or large farms where sheep, cattle, and wine were raised, not grain. Okay, the staple crop that the independent farmers raised was grain previously. Okay, so the latifundia were these large landed estates that were consolidated either by patricians or the new rich equestrian class. These plantations, or latifundia, tended to be worked by slaves from the newly conquered area rather than free labor. So one result of the wars of expansion is an influx of slave, a decline in free labor, an influx in slaves. So as a result, when the legionnaires returned from the war, they found that their farms were gone, that they had been dispossessed from their land. This was their thanks for fighting the wars of expansion, and they were forced to migrate to the cities. So now these poor, dispossessed veterans were landless urban poor, who were forced to try to find work in the cities. So this problem, the decline of the independent farmer, is, like I told you, a social, economic, political, and military problem. Militarily, basically because the farmers were expected to provide their own weapons and equipment, the Romans can no longer meet the numbers for the draft because their support base is disappearing, right? So there aren't enough independent farmers to draft anymore. And moreover, there were actually draft riots. Those men who still were able to hold on to their farms rioted. There were major draft riots between 151 and 138 BCE. And the message was that they didn't want to go on fighting for Rome's expansion. They were more happy to fight when it concerned defense of territory in Italy, but less so fighting these distant wars away from Rome. So in any case, there were these major draft riots. The prospective draftees appealed to the tribunes to stop the consuls from conducting the draft. Additionally, the decline of the small independent farmer will have important effects on the political system. So typically, the aristocratic commander and the everyday soldiers were bound together in this traditional system of patron-client relations. The soldiers were loyal to their commander as a patron because he gave them handouts from the conquest. They didn't receive a salary per se. But increasingly, this traditional attitude, this looking to aristocratic commanders as a father-type figure, is questioned because these wars of expansion began to break down the traditional bonds of clientage. These disgruntled veterans increasingly discard the old system of politics based on kinship and patronage and family for more practical politics based on their economic needs. So this is sort of a more subtle change, but previously, in the old understanding, in the old ways of the father, votes previously were thought to sort of belong to a patron by an ancient custom. It was almost automatic that these legionaries would have voted for their commander. Those votes belonged to him. But now votes came to be thought of increasingly as free. Okay, so again, the citizen militia is declining. It cannot raise enough money to supply the weapons, the legions aren't raising enough numbers. Additionally, so the decline of the independence farmer is a social, economic, and military possession, and sort of subtly it begins to challenge the old unwritten laws of the Roman Constitution and the way that the elders ruled. Additionally, at the same time, though, this is a dynamic that's in tension. It's two things pulling in the opposite direction, right? So to make this very simple, I suppose you could say the middle classes are getting poorer, or the poor are getting poorer, and the patricians and the new equestrian classes are getting richer. But at the same time, the Senate's authority was informally increased. The Punic Wars strengthened the Senate's informal control over government, making it even tighter than in the past. Why? Because the Senate was the repository of experience. The Senate had provided the winning generals who commanded the troops in the war, and again, although all of this was informal, they particularly claim their authority over the issues of foreign policy and finance. Okay, so again, buttressing what was already there, right? The Senate increasingly felt itself to be in charge of all affairs of state, particularly foreign policy and finance, and expected their opinions to be automatically listened to. Now, there were tensions within the Senate. There was still a tremendous amount of social tensions. Plebeians do have access to the Senate and all other political offices, but non-traditional, non-patrician families were still looked down upon socially in the Senate. So that's something to keep in mind. Increasingly, there is an influx of new classes in the political system that weren't really a part of the traditional Roman way of doing things. Okay, simply put, the political system didn't evolve to represent the new classes. There is an influx of slaves, the new urban poor, the dispossessed farmers, as well as the growth of the equestrian class and slaves. So we already mentioned the slaves, the influx of slaves from the empire, as well as an equestrian class. The slaves are employed in agriculture on the latifundia, in manufacturing, also as domestic slaves. But even more significant is the rise of the equestrian class. The equestrian class is made up of wealthy individuals. It's sort of a nouveau riche who were very wealthy. They typically did not serve in the Senate because of social snobbery, but their preferred area of operation was finance. Okay, so the equestrians were often richer than the old patrician class. Often richer than the old patrician class. The equestrians worked in banking, in trade, and manufacturing. And they also served as tax collectors for the state. Now, these professions, these financial professions, were looked down upon by the traditional Roman patrician classes. The patricians' wealth was based on landholding. It was very simple. The patrician classes would not have wanted to dirty its hands with these money, with these sort of monetary commercial professions. So the patricians were happy to let the equestrian class have a monopoly on these new professions. So definitely, because the equestrians are supplying contracts for the war, manufacturing arms, supplying the army with food, their economic power rose. However, politically, there was really no place for them in the traditional Roman constitution. Not because they couldn't stand for office, they were allowed to run for any office they want to, or even serve in the Senate, but this sort of social snobbery, this networking of important old families continues. Additionally, I would also like to mention another profound change, and that would be the meltdown of traditional values. Okay, it is said that in this late Republican period, the old civic virtue is undermined, and new values of greed and arrogance and materialism replace the old school Roman values of frugality, moderation, and discipline. Okay, this parallels the decline of the independent citizen farmer. I tried to stress to you in our first lecture on family. The Romans are very, hold family values very near and dear, and along with that, ideals of modesty. So even the patricians, even the upper classes, while they lived well, they did not live in a way that was very lavish. They lived essentially the same way as the plebeians did. Now, it is said that after the wars of conquest, the Romans became intoxicated with the unimagined wealth that poured in from the new empire, from the east. And this served to undermine the old civic virtues, the old belief in modesty. And Romans became intoxicated with arrogance, with the luxuries of the Eastern world. And particularly, it was the equestrian class that was thought to be living in a luxurious manner. So this was a very important sort of cultural change. Likewise, the status of women improved in the late Republican period. There was a new form of marriage, which was called usus, U-S-U-S, which basically allowed women to be much more free than the traditional type of patrician marriage, conferatio, which that's the one I mentioned, where the father has full authority over her throughout the lifetime, and the husband to a lesser extent. So the ideals of patria potestas were questioned in this new form of marriage. Basically, women were allowed to own property in this new form of common law marriage, and they had more legal freedom of men. So I would argue that ideals of patria potestas, the authority of the fathers, are questioned both in the real family and in the greater political system. The lower, the sort of backbone of the Roman armies, no longer looking to the upper classes as the guardians of their interests. So we might say that the unspoken, unwritten consensus of the Roman constitution begins to be changed and challenged. And particularly the tribunes, some radical revolutionary tribunes, will exercise the power of their office to, the strict legalities of what it was able to do. Okay, so if that makes sense, not just listening to the elders, but really pushing the ticket with the authority in their office. The best example of this was the radical tribunes, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. So the first step in breaking down the traditional patterns of Roman government would not be taken by outsiders to the elite circles at all, but very much to aristocrats, to patricians who were firmly entrenched in the old Roman system, but who took it upon themselves to become guardians of the people, who both were elected as tribune. Okay, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus hailed from very well connected Roman families on their mother's side and on their father's side. Now it's very interesting. Both of these men have posthumously been claimed in later eras as radical Democrats, as sort of primitive communist, as men of the people. For instance, in the Russian Revolution, Lenin has special statues to the Gracchi brothers erected and plaques honoring the Gracchi brothers elected. So we'll think about how radical were these two really. But my point is first that they are from elite, well-connected Roman families. On their mother's side, they were descendants of Scipio Africanus. By marriage, they were connected with the best families in Rome. Their brother-in-law was a general. Tiberius's father-in-law, so the father of his wife, was actually the Speaker of the House and the Senate. On the influence of the family, supposedly they were shaped by their pious mother. Let me see here. Now, this is a famous picture, a painting of the Gracchi brothers from the 18th century by a female painter called Angelica Kaufmann. And I'm just showing this here because it shows you this meltdown of traditional Roman values. Okay, so these are the Gracchi brothers. And this is their mother, Cornelia, their virtuous mother, Cornelia. And basically, so you see Cornelia here with another Roman matron, another Roman mother, who is typical of the materialism of some patrician families, some equestrian families. It's not clear here who she is, but this typical of this new greed and materialism of the late Roman era. So this woman, this mother, is pointing to her jewels as her treasures and bedecked in finery. Whereas Cornelia is simple, she's not wearing any gold, and she's gesturing, she's pointing to her children as her true treasures and legacy. So the idea is that although these are a well-connected family, they were pure, they were modest, and they did not want Rome to succumb to these false values. Supposedly they were shaped politically by their mother. Okay, so first it would be Tiberius, who would be elected tribune in 133 BCE, and he had a radical plan to transform the Roman state. Keep in mind that it was perfectly legal in the Roman constitution for patricians to be elected to the office of tribune. Now, I want you to think about what they do. It's not only what they propose, it's how they do it, and how they do it challenges the traditional mode of operation in the Roman system. Okay, Tiberius believed, rightly so, that Rome's problems were caused by the steady decline of the independent citizen farmer, who was being pushed off the land by the latifundia, by wealthy landowners, which, of course, was making it impossible to meet the numbers for the draft, for the legions. Like we said, the army just didn't have enough recruits. So Gracchus's plan, Tiberius's plan, was to tap into the public land, which the state had claimed back in the wars of Italian expansion, okay, in the past century, and redistribute the land. Actually grant the dispossessed farmers plots of land so that they could continue serving in the army. Okay, so you can already see this idea of land redistribution, right? He's proposing redistributing the land to these dispossessed farmers was something that resonated with the Bolsheviks, the communists, later in history. Now, the question was, what were his motives? In redistributing the land, would the veterans become his clients? Would he become a new sort of patron to them? It's important to think about. This is something that's debated. However, the program was problematic because this public land had already been parceled out. This land won in the wars of Italian expansion had already been parceled out and sold. Sometimes it was claimed by, mostly claimed by either patrician or equestrian Roman families. So many of these wealthy patricians did not want to give up the land that they had purchased. Now, technically, there was a law that limited the amount of land that these patricians could acquire to about 300 acres. So they didn't want to give up the land. They didn't want to have the land redistributed. But what was truly revolutionary about Tiberius was not just the proposal himself, right? Some wealthy Romans may have gone along with the law, to give the army the manpower it's needed. What is truly radical about Tiberius is how he pulls the carpet out from the sort of foundations of Roman government. How he will openly challenge four basic foundations of Roman government. How he challenges the foundations of clientage or patronage, collegiality, annuity, and the general idea of listening to the authority of the fathers. Listening to the authority of the fathers. So all this happens in 133 BCE. Okay. So again, he has this proposal to redistribute the public lands from the Italian war. And really what he does is to defy the informal limits of the system, to defy the unspoken rule of the authority of the elders. Now, in fact, Gracchus's law is not quite as revolutionary as it sounds, because technically he was just trying to enforce a law that was already on the books. There was a law passed back in 367 BCE that limited the amount of land that any one individual could hold from the new public lands to 300 acres. So really, in redistributing the land, he's just trying to enforce a law that was on the books. Okay, but why was he so revolutionary? Well, first of all, what truly offended the old school senatorial families was how he trampled and challenged their authority openly. So he bypasses the authority of the Senate. He did not seek the advice of the Senate. He did not wait for the senatorial decree, the piece of advice. He simply takes the issue directly to the plebeian assembly, to the tribal assembly. He skipped the senators. And of course, the law passes through immediately. So it passed the plebeian assembly, and of course, the veterans flood into Rome and pressure the People's Assembly to vote for it. However, so not only does he challenge the authority of the Senate, the ways of the fathers, he challenges the principle of collegiality. Okay, remember Tiberius is one of 10. One of the 10 tribunes vetoed the law, right? He thought it was his authority to step in when his colleague Tiberius had gone too far. This person happened to be called Octavius, and I think very much that Octavius felt pressured by the senators to adhere to tradition. However, Tiberius begs Octavius to withdraw his veto. Okay, Octavius had the right to to veto what Tiberius had gotten through the assembly. He begs Octavius to stop, to beg down, to back down. But Tiberius refused to accept the veto of his colleague. Now this is the remarkable. Octavius comes in with the veto, and Tiberius refused to accept his colleague's veto. And he does something that is unprecedented. Tiberius does something that is unprecedented. He calls a special meeting of the People's Assembly, the plebeian assembly, and puts forward a special motion to remove his colleague, the colleague that defied his authority, from office. So apparently Octavius was very emotional about all this. Tiberius begged Octavius to back down, but he didn't. So one by one, as the tribes voted, it was clear that Octavius was going to be removed from office. And still, Octavius, the one that opposed Tiberius, refused to back down. As he saw, so the story goes, the senators looking down upon him from their perch on top of the hill. So he removed his colleague from office. He openly defied the Roman principle of collegiality. He went ahead with the law to redistribute the land, and he starts to establish a commission to actually implement the law and administer it. But the next thing he would do would be to defy the law of annuity. Remember, the annuity idea was the idea that public officials only had a limited tenure in office of 1 year. He defied the principle of annuity by standing election for tribune for a second year, for 132 BCE. And his plan was to also widen his reforms, okay, to get the equestrians to buy into his system. However, this was enough for the traditional ruling classes. Believing that Tiberius was a tyrant, he was a demagogue that flaunted his own power and defied the ways of the elders. What we see is that a crowd of angry senators beat Tiberius to death using wooden benches in front of the Senate house and threw his body in the river. So in a very brief period of time, all in a period less than a year, Tiberius Gracchus not only made this revolutionary proposal for land reform, but defied these unwritten rules of the Roman constitution, the principles of collegiality, annuity, patronage, and listening to the ways of the elder. As if the family hadn't learned the lesson, 10 years after his brother's death, his younger brother Gaius became tribune of the people. And he had a new strategy which carried on his brother's legacy, but was designed not only to appeal to the urban mob and the poor veterans, but also the equestrian classes. His plan sort of had something for everyone. So something for the plebs, something for the equestrians, and also for the non-Roman Italian allies. So he offered equestrians lucrative contracts as tax collectors in the new provinces of Asia. Also offered equestrians control of extortion courts that handled cases of senatorial misconduct in the provinces, that handled cases of misconduct for governors. So the general point is that he is trying to carve out a space for the equestrians in the system. The tradition was that senators occupied these positions as tax collectors. For the urban crowds, he went even a step further than his brother, as he advocated and had the People's Assembly pass laws to fix the price of grain. So the price of grain would be kept artificially below the market value, so the people could afford to eat. This is also related to the decline of the small independent farmer, right? Because the independent farmer is producing grain to sell on the market, whereas these plantations are sort of producing more things like grapes and sheep farms, not the grain staple. So in any case, he's fixing the price of grain. He's also instituting a sort of New Deal of sorts. He's instituting public building projects to give the poor urban masses employment. Also, he went a step beyond his older brother and urged that all members of the Roman Confederation, so all of the so-called Italian allies who were serving in the army, be given the full rights of Roman citizenship, so that they had rights to all political offices. This never would be passed during his lifetime. So he is appealing to a broader spectrum of interest than his brother, equestrians, urban poor, and the Italian allies. But he too would follow the violent death of his brother. He would be forced out of office in 122 BCE. He would be decapitated, and he would be killed and thrown into the river. So from this point onward, we can really say that the Romans' old traditional system of patron-client relations has been destroyed, that the ways of the elders has been permanently questioned, and we can say that politics becomes much more heated. It's much more confrontational. So we have politics polarizing down into a struggle between the so-called optimates and the populares, the optimates and the populares. So populares would have been politicians like the Gracchi brothers. The Gracchi brothers are really the first of the populares. Politicians who are on the side of the people. Optimates are politicians who want to do things the old way, who are appealing to the upper classes. And keep in mind, it's not only the content of what they are doing, it's how they are doing it. So in other words, the populares bypass the authority of the Senate, whereas the optimates respect the authority of the Senate. Okay. So much of this is rooted in this decline of the independent citizen soldier and the growing disparity between rich and poor in this late imperial period. And there will be a profusion of violence in this last stage of the Roman Revolution. The death of these two brothers is really only the beginning. Now, okay, there is a text for you, which is posted right below this week's video lecture. And I'd like to go through it with you a little bit. So this is a text dealing with the Gracchi brothers. And I want to use it for our discussion question this week. We don't need to read all of it together because it deals with what I dealt with in the lecture here. But briefly, there's a few main things I will point out. So here you can see the policy of the public lands that were came from the Italian wars of expansion being discussed. Okay, so you see that there. Okay. Now, here we have the point where Gracchus is coming in. For these reasons, the Roman people became troubled, lest they should no longer have sufficient allies of the Italian stock, lest the government itself should be endangered by a vast number of slaves. Okay, so here you can see exactly what I told you. The rich form these large latifundia. They are very large, and they are using slaves from the wars of conquest to farm them. Okay, for these reasons, the Roman people became troubled, lest they should no longer have sufficient allies of the Italian stock, unless the government itself should be endangered by a vast number of slaves. Okay, so they're referring to the lack of men available for the draft, for the army. At length, Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, an illustrious man, eager for glory, a most powerful speaker, and for these reasons well known to all, delivered an eloquent discourse while serving as tribune concerning the Italian race, lamenting that a people so valiant in war and blood relations to the Romans were declining little by little in pauperism and paucity of numbers without any hope of remedy. So he's referring to the decline of the citizen soldier. He inveighed against the multitude of slaves as useless in war and never faithful to their masters, and adduce the recent calamity brought upon the masters by their slaves in Sicily. So there was a major slave revolt in the same year, just the year before Gracchus became tribune, where the demands of agriculture had greatly increased the number of the latter, recalling also that the war waged against them by the Romans, which was neither easy nor short, but long protracted and full of vicissitudes and dangers. So here you can see what I told you. After speaking thus, he again brought forward the law providing that nobody should hold more than 500 jugera of the public domain, which is about 300 acres, you can see. But he added a provision to the former law that the sons of the present occupier might each hold 1/2 of the amount, and that the remainder should be divided among the poor. So he's not throwing the former owners off entirely, but giving them half of this. So basically he's making a strong argument in favor of free labor versus slave labor, and this is something we will talk about later, because one reason for the decline of Rome in general is because many scholars argue that slave societies tend to discourage technological innovation, tend to discourage industrial economies, tend to discourage more advanced methods of manufacturing, right? And the reason why is simple. If you have an unlimited repository of free slave labor, there's no incentive to develop labor-saving devices. And we think that this is a major reason why Rome declined. It tended to not place a premium on technological development, instead became mired by this system of slave labor. But in any case, Gracchus is saying it's much better to have free labor, men who will serve in the army. So basically, what Gracchus was trying to do was trying to actually enforce the law that was actually on the books, right? As I told you, it's not only what he's proposing, but how he's doing it. This was extremely disturbing to the rich because they could no longer disregard the doll as they had done before. He wasn't going to just let it slip. Nor could they buy the allotments of others because Gracchus had provided against this by forbidding sales. Okay, etc., etc., etc. You can go ahead and read this on the own. On the other hand, was the poor, the veterans. On the other hand, were heard the lamentations of the poor, that they had been reduced from competence to extreme penury, poverty, from that to childlessness, because they were unable to rear their offspring. So this actually affects the family too. They recounted the military services they had rendered, by which this very land had been acquired, and were angry that they should be robbed of their share of the common property. They reproached the rich for employing slaves, who were always faithless and ill-tempered, and for that reason unserviceable in war, instead of freedmen, citizens, and soldiers. Okay, so here we can see really where things are beginning to heat up, and you can go ahead and read this yourself. So in any case, you can see this is where he brings in the actual proposal for the land redistribution. And we see what I told you, that the law was passed. And here's the sort of the violent end of Tiberius. So Gracchus became immensely popular by reason of the law, and was escorted home by the multitude as though he were the founder, not of a single city or race, but all the nations of Italy. After this victorious party returned to the fields from which they had come to attend this business, the defeated ones remained in the city and talked the matter over, feeling bitterly and saying that as soon as Gracchus should become a private citizen, okay, that he would be sorry he had done despite to the sacred and inviolable office of tribune, and had opened such a foundation of discord. So basically, he would be sorry for challenging the authority of the fathers. Remember, during the period that he was tribune, the Romans believed that he was sacrosanct, that he was specially protected by the gods, that nobody could mess with him. However, here we see the violent end. So when the wealthy faction arrived at the temple and advanced against the partisans of Gracchus, they yielded to the reputation of a foremost citizen, for they saw the Senate following with him. The latter wrested clubs out of the hands of the Gracchans themselves, or with fragments of broken benches or other apparatus that had been brought for the use of the assembly, began beating them and pursued them. So it's this huge street fight, basically, between the Gracchi, Tiberius and his followers, and the old school senatorial families. In the tumult, many of the Gracchans perished, and Gracchus himself was caught near a temple and was slain at a door close by the statues of the kings. All of the bodies were thrown by night into the Tiber. On the subject of the murder of Gracchus, the city was divided between sorrow and joy. Some mourned for themselves and for him, and deplored the present conditions of things, believing that the Commonwealth no longer existed, but had been supplanted by force and violence. Others considered that everything had turned out for them exactly as they wished. So I've really dwelled on the Gracchi brothers in detail because I think that they are, first of all, interesting characters shaped by their mother Cornelia. And more than that, they have an interesting place in the popular imagination. As I told you, to subsequent people in history, they have been portrayed as demagogues, as radical, sort of dangerous leaders who stirred up the mob. On the other hand, they've been portrayed as heroes of the people, as sort of quasi-socialist, quasi-communist heroes to the Bolsheviks because of their proposals for the redistribution of land. So I made to you a two-pronged argument about the Gracchi brothers. It's not only what they did, it's how they did it. They are spearheading this populare revolution, appealing directly to the people and bypassing the authority of the Senate and bypassing the traditional ways of the elders. So I would invite you in this week's blog post to give me your 2 cents on the Gracchi brothers. Where do you really assess their legacy? Do you think they are heroes of the people? Some historians have looked at the Gracchi brothers more shrewdly and said, well, you know, even though they are radically appealing to the people, they knew that the people would become their clients. They will become the new patrons of the people. So are they really as radical as they seem? But in any case, right, as the text shows us, after the Gracchi brothers, the traditional unwritten rules of the Roman constitution are questioned, and in this struggle of the optimates and the populares, we will see a new era of military generals and a new use of force and violence that had been totally unprecedented. Okay, this will result in the crumbling of the empire, the crumbling of the republic, and the ushering in of the empire. Okay, so we will finish up the Roman Revolution in our last lecture for this week.